Welcome to the Subjective Professor podcast, where we reject coercion and hypocrisy. This is episode 64, and we're going to talk about how Americans are the battered spouse of their government. But just before we begin, just don't forget Ron Paul Institute of Peace and Prosperity, his one-day conference, September 2nd, 2023. A lot of great speakers. He does this every year. So be sure to check it out. I'm going to be there, and I'm going to try to make it every year as well from now on. But anyway, so a battered woman or battered spouse, how does it develop? Well, according to the website where I saw this, the abuser will win over a new partner, often moving quickly into a relationship with tactics like love bombing, grand romantic gestures, and pressuring for commitment early. Second, the abuser will be emotionally or physically abusive. This often starts small, like a slap instead of a punch or punching the wall next to their partner. The abuser will feel guilty, swearing they'll never do it again, be overtly romantic to win their partner over. There will be a temporary honeymoon period where the abuser is on their best behavior, luring the partner into thinking that they're safe and things really will be different. Abuse occurs, starting the cycle all over again. So our government, how do they love bomb the people? They do that through political promises. While they're campaigning for office, they're going to make these grand gestures, these huge promises, of course, which it's impossible for them to deliver, but people like to hear it. They've been socialized to look for it. They've been socialized by their educational system, professors, teachers, that the person who says this, that's the good person, right? So politicians, knowing this, cater to the message. This is, if you understand postmodernist discourse, this is the hegemony, right? So people are pre-taught certain ideas, and then the people who seek to take advantage of that, they basically say the lines that people were taught to expect and look for as a signal for who the good guy is, who's saying the right thing. So love bombing is basically government-funded programs and subsidies. When the government promises to steal from some people through taxation, then to sort of pretend to fulfill the promises that they made during their political campaign, people love that. And so therefore that would be the love bombing. The abusive aspect of this relationship, how does the government become abusive? Well, they target and arrest certain members of society. I don't know if you heard, but there was this older gentleman who wrote something on social media, and then he was raided. His house was raided by the FBI, guns drawn in the middle of the night, and they shot him to death, right? Which is kind of interesting, right? Because he was pretty much invalid, right? He couldn't walk around very well. So there was no way he was ever actually going to carry out any of his threats. But yet you have lots of celebrities making extremely threatening, even one celebrity had a severed, bloodied head of the sitting president. But hey, it's all good. So targeting certain people, right, for saying certain things on social media, that will, subject that person to abuse. And because it's only certain people who are talked about and portrayed in a certain way, most of the people in the United States really don't notice, and they don't care, or they basically say, well, they must have deserved it. And then there are no apologies. This is where it kind of breaks down a little bit, right? The government never apologizes. They have no liability. They have sovereign immunity. And so therefore, they don't need to apologize. I mean, the government can kill 1 million people in a foreign country based on a lie. I don't know, something like weapons of mass destruction, kill 500,000 children, okay, in Iraq, and no need to apologize. And then, of course, the honeymoon period is that adjustment before another set of new regulations and laws designed to take away the freedom of the people are adapted to. That becomes the honeymoon period, right? So people make the adjustment and then they say, okay, let's wait for that next election because now I'm going to vote for the right person this time. So the battered women spouse, how they get trapped. And this is again from that online website. So financial dependence on the abuser, which the abuser often manufactures, to wanting to have a complete family unit for the children's sake. 3, being afraid to leave. 4, disbelief or denial that the partner is actually abusive. 5, severe depression or low self-esteem that makes them think the abuse is their fault. And finally, believing that if the abuser loves them, it's okay, right? Because they can change their behavior. So how is the government trap the people? Well, it's from welfare, government services, subsidies, right? So, for example, student loans, that has been taken over by the government. Private banks no longer give out student loans. And so how are these student loans given? They're guaranteed, right? Well, it's by inflation. So people more and more depend on government handouts, government provided programs, not realizing that they're overpaying for all of those services, right? Like highways. I mean, seriously, we're using the same technology for building roads as we did when I was a kid, and that was 50 years ago. Yeah, that's not, that doesn't make any sense. So clearly, the government will use programs and methods that they've always used. So there is no investment into developing new methods, cheaper methods, because that's not the goal. The goal is to preserve the jobs, not streamline the process. And then people are afraid to leave. I mean, it will be anarchy, right? In the misunderstood definition of anarchy, it'll be chaos, right? Without government ordering us around, locking us down, there'll just be anarchy because people don't know how to live independently. And then the disbelief, well, most people growing up in the United States, they're taught that the United States government is a system of checks and balances. Yeah, right. Okay. So if you look at our government now, the judicial system does not, uphold the laws. There's a lot of interpretation. There's a lot of politicking, which is why when, for example, they're going after Donald Trump, they try to pick a location where they're guaranteed or have a higher probability of getting a conviction, right? So most people believe that if government goes away, everything will fall apart. No, it's the existence of the government that everything is falling apart. There's also that whole don't vote third party, you're throwing away your vote, right? That's another sort of knock on your ability to make a decision, right? Giving you low self-esteem and saying, oh, it's your fault that the right person wasn't elected, that kind of thing. And then, when the part of the trap is that people think that the abuser actually loves them. And so people will say, oh, but my candidate loves me. And there are many examples, right? So Donald Trump abandoned everyone who was falsely accused of the January 6th event. I refuse to call it what other people are calling it because that certainly was not a rebellion of some kind. Just check out over what's going on in Africa if you want to know what a real rebellion looks like. Okay, next. Oh, also, my candidate loves me. I mean, seriously, sending all that money to Ukraine, nothing for Hawaii, a state that voted 2-1 in favor of Brandon. That's kind of interesting, right? Signs of a battered spouse. Okay. I'm moving through this very quickly. Okay. Because a lot of it is just pretty much technical, but after a while, it'll get kind of tedious. you're like, I get the point, right? But hey, let's go through it because it works all throughout, right? So signs of a battered spouse, they think that the abuse is their fault, hide the abuse from friends and family, fear for their life and the lives of their children, believe that the abuser is all knowing and can see their every movement, be afraid and never know what side of their partner they'll see that day, a loving partner or an abuser. So how does the government fit that? Well, we talked about projection the other day. So instead of seeing all of the fault, all of the, the damage and problems created in yourself, you project it onto others, right? And so that's another defensive mechanism, as I went over in that episode. So it's the other countries that are bad, right? It's not the United States that's causing all of this civil unrest all over the world. No, that's Russia, that's China. That's Niger, it's that projection to avoid self-examination. Plus, we have all this surveillance now. Everyone knows now that all the microphones are recording phones, emails, phone calls, all online shopping habits. All of this stuff is being surveilled. All of the information is being swept up and recorded so that if you become politically inconvenient, they can just dive into that knowledge database, that treasure trove of information to dig up stuff to use against you. Someone I know is a police officer, and he said that's what they do. If they pick up someone, take them down to the station, and then they go through all of the books to try to find violations, right? So that the rap sheet is really long, which increases the probability of getting a conviction, right? So government does that too. And then, of course, we're afraid to see what side of the partner they'll see. Well, what new law is going to be passed to restrict our freedom? What new policy is going to come down the pipe mandating this, requiring this or else? And it's that thing, you're on the hook because you've accepted healthcare, you've accepted a student loan, and now if you don't comply with the new mandate, then they'll take away whatever it is that you have become dependent on, right? And that's how they trap you. So warning signs that you're in an abusive relationship. Well, if you start withdrawing and making excuses not to see friends or family or do activities they once did, seeming anxious around their partner or afraid of their partner, having frequent bruises or injuries they lie or can't explain, they lie about or can't explain, having limited access to money, credit cards, or transportation, showing extreme difference in personality, getting frequent calls from a significant other, especially calls that require them to check in or make them seem anxious, having a partner who has a temper, becomes jealous easily, or is very possessive, wearing clothing that could be hiding bruises like long sleeve shirts in the summer. So how is the government like this? How is our relationship with the government like this? Well, making excuses for indefensible behavior, right? So falling asleep at a meeting with the families of survivors who died in a fire on a tropical island that belongs to the United States, right? Oh yeah, he's not falling asleep. It's he's meditating. He's in prayer, right? Isolationism, we see as a country through sanctions. And then we talked about isolationism before, but a lot of people will accuse peace activists as being isolationists. And this is such a twisting of the words. And we talked about this before, but isolationism is nationalism. That's what the Communist Manifesto always talks about, becomes self-reliant, right? Don't trade with other people, just use up all of the resources that are in your own country. Whereas free market proponents want trade with everybody because it promotes peace and harmony, as well as spreading prosperity all over the world. including and especially to poor countries. Remember, Niger, they were threatened when they had their coup. France, who used to be in control of that country, they threatened that, hey, if you don't restore the previous president, we're going to cut you off from all French monies. And they were like, hey, you were in charge of our country for what, 50 years, promising wealth and prosperity to everyone, and we're still poor. So I think we can do all right without your money. Okay, so isolationism is actually what the government wants through sanctions, war, all this other kind of stuff, particularly the United States, since we have the reserve currency of the world. Sanctions are imposed by denying countries access to dollars, a very, very brutal, horrible way of conducting foreign policy. That creates isolationism. Bruises? What do you call the ever-increasing standard of living through inflation, right? It's like, oh, gas prices are going up. Oh, it's because people are driving more. What? Are you really? Okay. Or maybe you say, oh, gas prices going up. Yeah, see, that's why you got to use electric cars, which recharge using electricity produced by fossil fuel burning plants, or, power plants, or we can use electricity from windmills that are being drilled into the ocean, which is killing whales by the dozen. There's something like 70 whales now have died on the East Coast because of all of the windmills that are being constructed over there, right? The pounding that they need to do into the ocean floor so that the windmills don't collapse, fall over and crash. Well, that's really disrupting and killing a lot of sea life. No one really cares about that, right? Also, if you've ever seen a windmill fire, right, when they break apart, the amount of CO2 that it produces when it's burning down far exceeds any kind of savings you could have gotten from that windmill in its entire lifetime, like if it didn't break down. So there's that too. I should do a climate change episode soon. But anyway, low quality products with no jobs, right? I talked about that before, where a lot of my students were asking me where all the jobs are, right? Well, they were taxed out of the country. They were taxed out of the city, taxed out of certain states. And so therefore, the only jobs that are left are service jobs, like at restaurants, tending bar. And those jobs disappear in an economic downturn, right? Because people don't have the money to go to restaurants. And so why would you, what happens to all the people who are in the service industry there? Also, people are engaging in behavior incentivized by moral hazards, right? They are making bad decisions that are incentivized by all this government welfare, government subsidy and spending. And so people get hooked and then start doing things, right? And they all have to keep tabs. They have to report all of their finances, right? And so the government knows what's going on in your life. And then there's the anxiety of the uncertainty, all of which is caused by government. Inflation, how much are things going to cost next year? Is inflation going to rise? Is it going to fall? Where should I park my money? All of these things creates anxiety. I should know. I get anxious when I think about these things. Okay, so let's talk about treatment. The first, and this is from the website, right? The first step in treating battered women syndrome is to get the person to a safe place away from their abuser. Second, if you or someone you care about is living with a battered woman syndrome, you can form a safety plan and a getaway plan without the abuser. Well, yeah, of course. It's also good to have a doctor examine any injuries that may have been sustained in the abuse. A therapist with experience in PTSD or domestic abuse should be consulted. The therapist needs to validate the victim when they detail their abuse. Finally, the therapist should help them to understand that none of this was their fault and should also help empower them. Well, if you voted for this, right? This is the problem, right? Most people think that they are voting for change or hope or whatever, but really you're voting for the establishment. Think about this, right? No matter who was elected, we keep getting the same, and it's worse, right? It keeps getting worse. None of us are in the driver's seat, right? It doesn't matter who runs for election, generally speaking, right? There are a couple exceptions, right? But there are so few in number that it makes it seem like there's no one in Congress who are trying to push back against this abusive government. So none of us are really in the driver's seat. I mean, think about it. People used to pretend that the government had a mandate to control our lives. Hey, this is what the people wanted, right? I got all these votes. Now, you look at the approval ratings and the people don't even want most of the things that the government is doing. Now, doesn't matter. We can't stop them, right? So before, it used to have this appearance of following the will of the people. You don't have that now. I mean, most people want the money to stop flowing to Ukraine and be used here in the United States. But of course, as some people say, and FTX bore this out, but it's a money laundering operation, right? So money is sent overseas. A lot of the politicians over there are skimming the money, and they then turn around and send money to lobbyists here in the United States, who then go to politicians and promise them prizes if they continue to vote in favor of the war. So that's the money laundering aspect of it. It's not conspiracy theory. That's the reality. And FTX also, when the whole thing blew up with Sam Bankman-Fried, it was clear money was going to FTX, and that money was being donated back into the coffers of the Democratic National Convention, right? So clearly money laundering is happening. It doesn't matter what the people say, what the people want. Politicians are going to do whatever it is that they want to do. So we're in an abusive relationship, and what is the escape, right? How do we get out from under this? And I guess there are many, many different ways, and everyone is going to do it in the way that they think best. Personally, for me, it's about information, getting information out to the people who would listen to me, people over whom I have influence, whether it's in my congregation or my family. So that's one way of doing it, helping them to make decisions which will prepare them for whatever's coming, in spite of whatever the government does, in spite of any new regulations that the government imposes on us. And then there's the more sort of radical, right? Is there going to be an economic collapse? Which bankrupts the government, and therefore they can't fund anything, and so therefore everything falls apart. That is worst case scenario. I hope it never comes to that. In the intermediate approach is something which I also am trying to do, is become more active in my community, right? If you, in your so-called small town, if you can make your small town livable, right? Then when things start to go sideways, then being active in your community, you can be an influence, a positive influence to guide people in a way where they can find solutions instead of going to the government for solutions, right? Finding solutions on their own. Getting friendly with the police department, for example, to make sure that their policies are favorable to the rights of their community members, things like that. And that's kind of a little bit of what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to get active in my own community just by getting to know people, getting to know the police department, the fire department, the township officials, all of this kind of stuff. Just so you can see what's going on, at least some of it anyway, and then maybe become a positive influence that way. So Americans are the battered spouse of the federal government, of government in general. So perhaps we can exert some kind of positive change to our local governments, and at least for all of us to understand that this phenomena, what we're seeing, which is creating so much uncertainty and frustration, that's the source. And knowing the source, knowing what the cause of the problems may be, high probability that it is, will allow us to be able to begin taking steps to be able to get better, right? Get away from the very source of a lot of these problems. Who knows what's going to happen, but hopefully this argument made sense to you, and I'll talk to you in the next episode.